Hello, and welcome to our second episode of the Cultivate podcast. I'm really excited for all of you to join me today. We're going to be meeting with the Evergreen Anti-Racism Team. And what is that? What's that about? How does it come about? Who are the people involved? Those are some of the things we're going to be doing for this episode. And before we get into that, though, I wanted to have a moment to just speak with a good friend of mine, Reverend Dr. Victoria Carr-Ware, who is a senior pastor of Queen Anne Baptist Church. And we just want to talk a bit about, from a person of color perspective, about the importance of advocacy against racism and, just our own personal involvement, our thoughts about it, just to kind of be a bit of a preamble to discussion before we meet with the anti-racism team. So thank you for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you.
I imagine we'll have lots more to talk about in the future as well. But for this episode, I thought we'd just kind of kick off maybe some of your thoughts to open up just your experience about advocating against racism and your personal experience of it. Also, I would love to hear about the importance of how it's important that it's not just you advocating, but having kind of like a community behind you advocating. So,
Absolutely.
Yeah, so what are some of your thoughts on that?
Oh, geez. I think there's a way in which, when folks of color do the work of social justice, it kind of feels like preaching to the choir a little bit.
Right.
Like we all are sort of trying to fight for some kind of change and, share about the aggressions, the microaggressions, the outright, incidents of racism. And, if other folks aren't in the room, it's sort of like it's kind of lost on deaf ears. It's like, well, we all know, we all experience this. How do we change it? We can't just do it ourselves.
Yeah, and there's it's sort of exhausting in a way, isn't it? Because you're having to process the pain and the trauma of racism, but at the same time, you're trying to explain and articulate what my pain is, and then try and do a teaching moment.
You educate.
And educate, right? And all at the same time. And there's just a real exhaustion if it all has to come from us.
Absolutely.
Right, yeah.
There's just a real importance of having allies. And I think, for me, it's important for me to build relationships with folks from different cultures and races, because I think once you have those relationships, then you can, have those conversations with folks. But I think absent of that relationship, it does feel very weighty and heavy to be always pointing out to folks, let me educate you, let me teach you, let me show you why this is problematic, on top of the fact that it's problematic and I'm in pain. I may feel angry or sad about something, so you want to do it in a nice way. And it can be really it can weigh on you after a while.
Absolutely. So, I really like how you phrase that about the need for allies. So in your mind, what would you feel like as an ally that would really help you? And then also in the same token, what kind of ally is actually kind of more of a burden than an assistance?
Oh, goodness.
Yeah, where to begin?
I was actually talking with my husband about this last night.
Okay.
And I was saying, it feels like if people would take the time to educate themselves and to learn, there's so much. We were joking yesterday about back in the 80s, this was our Google encyclopedias, right? But there's so much at our fingertips right now, books and resources and all kinds of information. If people would just take the time to educate themselves, to learn about other cultures and the history of racism in our country, I think that would be a really important first starting point. And, having conversations with one another. Because I think it's hard to confess or to say things that, if you're with someone who's from your culture, there's a shared culture, there's a shared socialization, there's a shared experience, right? And so you may think to yourself, oh, I can maybe share something with them or say something to them and not feel so guilty or so uncomfortable. So I would hope that folks this anti-racism team, right? This to me is crucial work, that folks do the work themselves individually, that folks do group work, so they can come back and not sort of bleed on people of color or bring their guilt, and which I'm glad you're feeling some guilt, but it's not always helpful because we can stay stuck in our guilt instead of moving past that into action and restoration and reconciliation and doing the work to kind of rectify some of these problems.
Yeah, that's very insightful, because as a person of color myself too, sometimes the struggle is when we find allies, more of what we're dealing with our allies is like we're trying to actually like deal with their guilt and their shame, and all the energy is kind of put towards counseling them when we're being traumatized ourselves from things, right?
Like, so, I need counseling, I need help, y'all.
And it's like, well, now we got to take care of our friends now, right? And it can kind of like take away from the issues. Then we can't focus on like the systemic problems of racism, because we're kind of dealing in-house so much. Yeah.
But I will say, like Reverend Sam, Pastor Sam, all of your titles, that there is a different role, though, I feel, for Christians and Christian pastors in particular, where I feel like we need to be extending grace to one another, because it's really hard. Like we can all, like if we are all honest with ourselves, we can all think about our own privileges and our own oppression. Like both of these things are taking place. And so I feel like, I can say as a cisgender hetero person, like, oh, I benefit from that privilege. And so what do I need to do? And so that helps me to then be like, let me extend some grace to folks who are, white and who are dealing with their own guilt and their own shame. And but I need to do my work first, right? And then I can advocate and be an ally, because I've learned and I've educated myself. But I think that the difference is like we can extend more grace and bring people in. Doesn't mean that there's not, you don't have to work hard. It doesn't mean that I forgive you so quickly. It means that like we are reconciling together, and we are doing something to make amends, and we are making reparations, and we're doing whatever it is that we need to do to correct some of these things. But I think that as a Christian, as a pastor, we must call people in, because we all benefit from privilege in one way or another.
That's
honestly.
Right. That's a really great point about, especially just being North American, right? We're just privileged in some way or other, and that's what makes it so complex. Is like there's no perfect victim, there's no perfect oppressor, right? It's all very complicated. I appreciate that nuance. I wonder, like, what do you feel like is a challenge for our churches today in addressing, epidemics of racism around? I mean, that's such a big question, but like just for you as a pastor.
Well, I mean, what I see is I think a lot of people are having conversations, and not just in the church, but like just in, especially more progressive places like Seattle, places that call themselves progressive. But they aren't really working to change the culture. And so I think about like, I come from a predominantly Black church context, and our culture, like we want to say that we're multicultural, multi-ethnic, and a lot of churches want to say that they're that, but they aren't willing to change the actual culture. They aren't willing to get people in leadership, for example, who look different, who they aren't willing to work to rectify income inequality for pastors. So I think there's a way in which we can talk a lot, but then we don't actually put our money where our mouth is or look at the culture. Because I think it's sort of like, it's just a given. This is how church is. And I think we really need to take a step back and recognize the ways in which maybe, if I come to a church and everybody in leadership is a white guy, I don't see myself there. If I'm a Black woman or an Asian woman or if I'm a queer person, I don't see anybody in leadership. I think, the challenge is like, thinking we're doing this work by just simply reading or, having talks and discussions, which is an important first starting point. But I feel like there needs to be some other measures that are taken also.
Yeah. Yes, I completely agree with you. I think what's challenging about like the Northwest is like there's a self-proclaimed identity that we're very progressive.
Yes.
We're really far ahead. But then sometimes we just hide behind the labels, and then we don't check, like you're saying. And then we don't realize like maybe our practice is not as progressive as we think, even though we label ourselves as such or identify as such. Maybe our practice betrays that we're not as far along as we had hoped. I think that's very wise. Gosh, there's so much good stuff here. So many things I want to keep talking about. But I do want to bring on the team. Yes. But thank you so much for your time. And I'm hoping that we can have a further conversation.
Yes, we will.
In another episode. So thank you very much for your time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
All right. So now we're going to switch to talk to the anti-racism team in the flesh. And we're going to just talk to 3 other members. 2 of the other members we're going to hear from later. But yeah, I just wanted to kick off to understand a bit more about art, how you got involved, what your passions are for advocacy against racism. So I want to start with you, Wim. For the people who are listening and maybe are not aware of the anti-racism team or just know about it vaguely, could you tell us a bit about the story of art, of how it formed? Like, where did it start?
Well, it started in 2016, 17, right around in there. I went and saw Marcia Patton, who was the executive minister at the time, and asked her, what kind of things I might get involved in after I retired. And she said, well, you got to deal with the white privilege of Euro-Caucasus churches because the communication with the other caucuses is not going well. And so I started looking around, the 2 officers of the Euro-Caucasus at the time, very interested. Also, there was a group at University Baptist, which is now disbanded, but the people are still around. And Brooke was one of those, and there was a group of half a dozen people. And so together, we started to think about how is it that we might be able to reach out to the other Euro-Caucasus churches to just have conversations with them. And so we did those conversations mostly based on Eric Law's work and some of the books that he wrote, and just getting people to talk about race. And did a couple of those, and then realized, this is all interesting, but it's not really challenging for people. So about that time was when our new executive minister, Doug Bernal, came, and we started to work with him and kind of join forces and create a new kind of workshops that we then offered to different churches, and went to Salt Lake City, went to Good Shepherd in Linwood, and did those at the time, and then continued to offer those for several years.
Okay. So thank you. That's very helpful to know the story behind it. If that's where you started from, where do you feel like you are now in the journey of art?
Well, there's a couple of things. That one of them is that Reverend Doug has a connection with Seattle First Baptist, and we have been asked to kind of come alongside and continue to maintain the kind of training that he's already provided for them. It's working all that out is yet to really take hold, but so there's that. Also, there seems to be more of an interest of having a kind of region-wide workshop rather than focusing specifically on a particular church. That may have come partly because of COVID, and we've got the expansiveness of Zoom now that we can reach out to a whole bunch of people we couldn't before.
So I want to make sure I also interview the other folks here. So Caitlin, you're the newest member of ART, is that right?
Yeah.
So tell me a bit about how did you get involved with ART?
Yeah, so I'm definitely the newest member. I've been involved with ART for a couple of months at the invitation of Reverend Doug through my work at Queen Anne Baptist Church. I'm fresh out of seminary and new into full-time vocational ministry. I've kind of done it part-time in a lot of capacities. And I was in seminary. I was studying under the mentorship of Reverend Dr. Brenda Salter McNeil in the Reconciliation and Intercultural Study program at SPU. And through that and other things in my own faith journey, I've developed a passion for working in the church context and continuing conversations of anti-racism. And the art team was really interesting because I think it's definitely important work to work in affinity groups in these conversations for white folks, because in our journey of pursuing reconciliation, of pursuing anti-racism, there can be harm that is done. So I was just excited to get involved with art and to see what it looks like to pursue these conversations in affinity group spaces, working with Euro-Caucasus churches. And so right now I'm doing a lot of learning from the other folks in art, and I'm excited to kind of see where the future holds.
And let me tell you, it's great to have her, to have that fresh perspective. And it's just been great.
So, I'd be kind of curious to hear about, like, what do you feel like you bring to the table, both of you, like with your different perspectives, different generational backgrounds, and stuff like that?
You're asking me that?
Yeah, anyone.
I misunderstood. Well, like Wim, I'm really grateful to have met Caitlin, to start in the last month. We've been doing quite a bit of work together. This needs to be intergenerational. I'm in my early 80s. I know this will be important the rest of my life, and I flourish so much better when I get to work with younger people. It makes all the difference in the world to imagine that this is next Caitlin's world, and then it's my granddaughter's world. And how will our churches respond when white privilege, white supremacy is so hard to dislodge? It must happen. I can't die and feel that nothing has happened to begin to move that power structure. This just, it won't yield. It won't, as one neighbor of mine once said, it won't just take care of itself.
Well said. So that's very well said, Brooke. I really appreciate that. What do you feel is your hope or your desire for art? Like, what do you hope that it could accomplish within the Evergreen family?
Well, there are a lot of things that we've prepared and done. We have done workshops in local churches. We have done them, as Wim said, because COVID made us do it. We have done them more broadly online. But art, once people know that this resource, that this slightly more than handful of white people has begun struggling within themselves as a team, and then drawing in our church experiences. Once others see that this can happen, I believe they will be attracted to it. It will be an attraction not easily won. My experience in two churches, as a member in two churches in Seattle, says this is a hard thing for white people to face. It's so much easier to pretend, oh, this doesn't affect me, and surely it doesn't affect my church. I see it constantly, and yet I know there's promise in it. And I know that from the people I talk with in my own congregation now, that when there's an awareness that some are struggling with this and feeling that they're growing through it, that's attractive.
So, Brooke has talked very eloquently about the hopes of art, but I thought, Wim, because you've been there from the beginning, what are some of the challenges that you've faced with being in art in trying to get out this message and trying to get people on board? What are some of the biggest obstacles that you see in advocating against racism?
Well, particularly the resistance that we have come across trying to do workshops within congregations is that it's still a very divisive issue. And so what happens is that because we come in, we do the workshop, pastors are a little reluctant because they don't know exactly what we're going to say, first of all, and then what the reaction is going to be after that. And they don't want to have to be left holding the bag and putting the fires out, which is totally understandable. So that was the reason why we moved from doing it with one individual congregation at a time to doing it more broadly. But so we're thinking that just being able to, because people respond in at different rates. And so we're looking to just find those people in each congregation that are open to it or interested in taking the next step. And whatever that might be, we want to be there to support them.
Yeah, that's well said. I think the challenge of dealing with racism is that you can't just deal with racism because it touches so many things, right? It's so enmeshed in so many things that it intertwines. So when you address one part, it could trigger this guilt, shame, anger, all of these kind of complex emotions, and it can be kind of exasperating, I think, in a way. Caitlin, as you know, I teach sometimes a Christians Foundations class with the freshmen at SPU. And I found it interesting talking with this new Gen Z, maybe Gen Alpha, maybe we moved there already. Some of the students, they were talking to me, and they were talking like about, we feel like we were born into this world that's a dumpster fire or something, right? And there's so many systemic problems, the environment, racism, white supremacy. There is kind of the sense of like feeling overwhelmed, and then feeling this huge pressure that the older generation has dumped it on them to take care of it, because they just didn't know how to do it. So like, oh, you folks just live your life and save the world, right? I wonder, you're a little older than them, of course, but being sort of a younger generation, how would you maybe speak to some of your peers or people younger than you, dealing with that sort of feeling of like paralysis or being overwhelmed when dealing with racism?
Yeah. I think one thing I would say is that even though the church isn't always a great example of what it looks like to deal with these issues communally, that there is still hope in the church. And I think the church has a responsibility to learn how to respond to these issues and to lean into discomfort and to lean into conflict. And there are a lot of incredible young leaders in the church who are hungry for these conversations and who are working towards getting folks involved and getting people active in these conversations in the church. And it's easy to be disillusioned at the same time because it feels like the world is changing so quickly and the church sometimes can seem like it's digging in its heels. But one thing I would say is, don't lose hope and be real about it. I've learned the most from leaders in the church who are able to say that they've been wrong and that they're learning and growing. So I would encourage young folks to not lose hope, to still be involved and to be real and vulnerable in the process, because that is going to be a gift to the church to help it move forward.
Yeah, lots of good wisdom there. I was also thinking about like the prophet Elijah, when when we're in a crisis moment, we're kind of like, Lord, I'm all alone. And like the Spirit comes to us and says, there's thousands like you. And that's just a great reminder, is that it can feel overwhelming, but there's a lot of good people working for the same things you want. Well said, well said. So Brooke, you're like a longtime friend of Evergreen. You've been a part of the family for a long time. Where do you feel like most hopeful, or like where do you see the most energy in Evergreen in terms of inclusion and diversity?
Wow, that's a great question. I think I see it the most recent annual meeting, which happened in the building where I worship. It was wonderful to have people of all different ages, people who spoke differently, sounded differently, looked differently, dressed differently, willing to set aside the things that might have said, oh, I need a wall here because you're just too other than me, and begin to listen, begin to tell stories. I sat at a table early in that annual meeting where people were asked to think about what are the challenges that your church faces right now that feel insurmountable? The honest stories that people told at that table. I sat next to a black man who said, I'm part of a church now that's new and rising, and I'm not sure we do face any insurmountable objectives. We feel the future is wonderfully open to us. On the other side of me were two people, both white, who said our churches are facing a dearth of leadership except among the most old, and they're not able to give as much as they want to. To listen to those stories honestly and to know that they reveal a willingness to be vulnerable, one in front of another. It just gives me a great deal of hope. And I think that art can play a great role in that, because we, young and old, can help each other through the obstacles that we know in our own bodies, and then reach out into our own churches, and then, as Wim has said, reach out to a whole network of churches this is work that can be done.
Wow, well said. You know, it's kind of funny. Sometimes when we hear the word advocacy, we might conjure up the connotations of like, you know, strength, like anger, right? Like, but it's interesting as I'm talking with you folks, like the words and the themes that are coming up seem to be like humility, right? Understanding, vulnerability, compassion, right? Which makes a lot of sense, right? Because I think that's really the Christian offering that we can give to the world, is that this countercultural approach. Because I think a lot of times when we think about advocacy, it's like we're talking more about revenge or something, right? But when we have the cross as a center, like the central paradigm, it really flips things around. So I think that's really profound. Wim, as you've been a wonderful storyteller, telling us like where art came from, where it is right now. What do you feel like is some of the hopes that you have where it could go next?
You know, as I take a step back and envision it, I really hope that we will continue to just take whatever opportunities that are in front of us. And for example, ART, the Anti-Racism Team of the Euro Caucus, can work with the Anti-Racism Network, which is lay people in half a dozen congregations, and how is it that they're working within their congregations to do this very same work. And then there's the intercultural team that is trying to bring all of the caucuses together in a sense of family and to be one church. I mean, my sense is that, especially if we can work all of those and whatever opportunities that each of them has, that we can have conversations across caucus lines like we have not been able to have so far. And actually, Evergreen has much more potential than practically anywhere else, because we have these caucuses that have an equal voice within the life of Evergreen. We can have a sense of an equal footing, and then be able to begin those conversations that we haven't been able to have because of racism, and speaking as a white man, to become aware of the ways that I have just sort of minimized other people. And when I can then step back and engage with them on an equal footing, it's a new relationship.
You know, I've only been a part of Evergreen for maybe about 5.5 years. So it's, I was mentioning in the last episode, is that because this is my first understanding of ABC, I realized once I became part of Evergreen, got to know the other regions, now that I'm part of regional staff, I was like, oh, we're very different. But I remember at the beginning, I was trying to ask someone like, well, what's Evergreen about? And someone told me what Evergreen, why it was made, according to this person, was that it was to make sure that everyone had a seat at the table, you know? And I feel like what we've all been talking about today is just like, well, what does that mean? What does that look like in real life if everyone had a seat at the table, you know? And all those programs that you're describing, those groups, you know, your heart and your hope, your desires for Evergreen. It just seems like we're all working for that common aim, that we could all be, you know, at the same table. And it's really exciting. It's a real honor to be a part of a family that puts that at the center. So thank you very much for your time. So much great wisdom to glean from. I encourage you folks to talk to Wim or anyone else from the Anti-Racism Team if you want to learn more about how you can get involved, how you can advocate, be an ally. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing. I really appreciate it. And we will see you soon in our next episode. Thanks for joining us.